Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson, the Barbara Rabin Chief Education Officer here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you for joining us for the fourth in this week's series of 2024 Spring Break Survivor Speaker events. Today you will hear from Andras Lacko, Dr. Andras Lacko, who will share his experiences as a child in Hungary during the Holocaust. Before we begin, I would like to thank our community partners for the Spring Break Survivor Speaker Series, the Dallas Mavericks, the Legacy Senior Communities, SMU Human Rights Program, Southwest Jewish Congress. We are grateful for your support of the museum and our programs. We couldn't do it without you. I would also like to extend a special welcome to our board members, volunteers, and the whole row crew from the Legacy Senior Communities Midtown Park. I can see you all. Thank you for joining us. They have brought a giant cheerleading section every day this week. It's been fabulous. I would also say that we cannot fulfill our mission without all of you. And if you are interested in becoming members of the museum, please visit dhhrm.org or stop by our front desk guest services on your way out. They can certainly help you to make that happen. In just a moment, Dr. Lacko will share his story with you, and then we will have time for questions and answers. If you are here in the audience, you should have received an index card and a little golf pencil on your way in. Please feel free to write any questions that you might have for Dr. Lacko on that card, and when he finishes his remarks this afternoon, our staff will be around to pick that up from you. If you are joining us online, and I know there's 30 plus people who are joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to write out or type out your questions, and we will mix those into the questions for the Q&A period as well. Please also refrain from recording today's talk. It will be on our YouTube channel, so the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum YouTube channel, probably by the middle of next week, so you can watch it there again if you want to refer to it. Also, I would ask that you please either turn off your cell phones or click the button and put them on vibrate for the talk. I appreciate that. And it is now my really great pleasure to turn things over to Andy Lacko. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Cast and still showing. Hello? Is the microphone okay? Thank you. Thank you very much for bearing the bad weather forecast and showing up today. And a special thank you to our fellow residents at the Legacy Midtown Park who actually filled out the bus and showed up here. My task today is to tell you what is designated as my story, but it's really more than that. It's titled The Holocaust in Hungary. I'm going to talk in three parts. First, I'm going to start with my family background, just a little bit to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. Then I'll talk about the Holocaust and its impact in Hungary. And then toward the end, I'll talk about what is going to be my journey, that is my specific experience, which is really quite brief. And I think the uniqueness of the Holocaust in Hungary also includes its brevity, the short time that it took, and yet the tremendous cruelty and barbarism that the Nazis and even the Hungarian fascists were able to achieve was truly remarkable. The killing of Jews in Hungary was at the fastest rate of all the European Jews, and ended up 600,000 people being killed in a short period of about 7 or 8 weeks. So with that, I'll move on, I hope. The slides are not moving. Well, could somebody move the slides then? This remote is not working. But if somebody can move it, I can talk. Okay, go ahead. Next one. Okay, so this is the map of most of Europe, including Hungary on the right, and here, and the capital city, Budapest, which is where I was born. As you will see in another map, it actually was home for most of the Jewish people in Hungary, about 200,000 at the time the Second World War started. So this was the scene where my story took place, and actually, right. In the middle, my parents' picture at their marriage, 1934. To the left, you see me in my favorite place in the bed, where I actually managed to do a somersault and fall on my head. And a lot of the relatives actually attributed my lack of modest behavior to that accident, but that's perhaps not a good excuse. On the right, you see my mother's family, which was just before they were married. And I was just trying to emphasize the tremendous fortune and blessing we had during the Holocaust, which sounds like a paradox. But out of all these people, only 2 of them actually perished in the Holocaust, which is a very low percentage for a family of this size. This young lady right here and her father here were the ones who, to our knowledge, ended up in Auschwitz, and we never heard from them again. The rest of the people survived one way or another. And even my great-grandmother, who was in the middle of the picture right there, actually did not perish because of the Holocaust. She perished due to natural causes in 1943. So this is part of my family background. This is a little more detail about me. On the left, you see me in a devil's costume, which a lot of people considered highly appropriate. I also showed some musical talent, you can see with the drums, but actually I started piano lessons about age 5. On the right, you see my technical curiosity, which was not endorsed or taken with a great deal of thankfulness. And this was actually a highly unique event that they let me that close to the radio in fear of me causing some serious damage. Point being, we had a middle-class family, and the pictures you see actually are 1941, 42, at which time most of the Polish Jewish population was already exterminated. So again, I'm coming back to the remark I made earlier that Hungary was in a unique position during the Holocaust because Hungary was an ally of Nazi Germany as opposed to Poland and France and Czech Republic, a lot of other places. where the Jewish population was moved with a great deal more alacrity and speed, and found unfortunate consequences to follow, whether it's a concentration camp, a death camp, or confiscation of their family resources and so on. So this is the timetable showing the events that actually occurred in Hungary. And the Holocaust in Hungary only began as late as March 1944, which is again very late, because the persecution of Jews in Germany and even surrounding other countries began as early as 1938. But it never reached us in Hungary because of our unique political positions, because the Hungarian army fought side by side with the Nazi German army on the Russian front and actually suffered some devastating losses. But Germany did not insist on the very strict adherence to their policies that were actually brought about against Jews. So again, in March 1944, I remember to this day, my parents and I were actually coming out of a movie theater, and we saw the German military rolling on the street with tanks and trucks. And that's when the Holocaust began for us. By June, we were forced to move into special houses and into much smaller quarters per family. My family moved into my mother's uncle's apartment, and there were 18 of us in a two-bedroom apartment. There were some people who were much more crowded, and this was the usual system of concentrating the people before they were actually ordered and taken to concentration camps or death camps and reach unfortunate end. In July 1944, the transportation of Jews to Auschwitz in particular, which, as you probably heard, was a major death camp, was the largest one. And as I will show you, my mother had the good fortune and the smarts to find other ways to survive the Holocaust, and actually managed to obtain false papers. But I'll tell you more about it later. October 15 is an important date because at that time the Hungarian government actually officially gave up Hungary's participation in the Second World War, surrendered. The Germans immediately appointed a much more terroristic, fascist, very cruel government, who actually, as you will see one of the pictures, took up the process of actually lining up Jews on the side, on the bank of the Danube, and shooting them in the water because there were no more rolling stock available. The German army was hard-pressed for railroad cars. They could no longer take people to concentration camps or death camps. But this Hungarian fascist government did actually an even more cruel job than the Germans. And right after the war, there was a trial, and most of them were actually executed for their sins. So this is where our story begins during the Holocaust. Earlier, you saw my mother in her beautiful wedding dress. Well, this picture was taken when she was already in hiding with false papers. She actually took on a job as a dishwasher for about 3 months, and that's how she managed to survive. On the left, you see my father's identity papers in the Hungarian construction working group that was supporting the army. And he was in a camp that was working with the Hungarian army, cleaning up, building roads, doing things like that. But he was 100 miles away from home, so he was not with me or my mother. So when my mother went into hiding, as it says up in the upper right-hand corner, the family splits up. My father was away actually since 1943, but at that point I was left on my own without my parents. And that's when my own short journey begins during the Holocaust. The picture you see on the lower right-hand corner is shoes that were put there as a memorial for the Jews who were actually shot into the water after the transportation to death camps and concentration camps was no longer practical because the Germans did not allow railroad cars to be used for that purpose. They were desperate to use the railroad facilities for their military purposes. So, moving on, this gives you a little bit of logistic map of what the Germans and the Hungarian fascists had to contend with, trying to organize the transport of the Jewish population toward extermination. And you see the map of Hungary, and the little dots are identifying locations of synagogues where Jews have places of worship. You see the capital city, Budapest, with the largest circle, which means that was the largest population group right here. There is a fairly large concentration in the upper right-hand corner here, where the red arrow is, and that is the Hasidic Jewish group, Satmar Hasidim. Many of them actually managed to escape and establish large communities in the state of New York. Nevertheless, what had to be done is round up the Jews, take them, put them into railroad cars and transport them to the camps. Now, it was much easier to take part of the Jewish population from the surrounding communities compared to the capital city where I lived, which was a much larger population, about 200,000 compared to the scattered population around the country. So about 90+% of the population that were in the outlying communities, the Jewish population perished during the Holocaust, totaling about 600,000 killed out of the original population of just over 800,000, which represented Hungary as one of the larger Jewish communities in Europe. So these were the logistical tasks that the Nazis had to overcome. Now, you see the camps that were in famous places like Auschwitz, Majdanek, Sobibor, and so on. And on the next slide, oops, I don't have that, I guess. But these were the death camps around here. And there were concentration camps that were scattered in a much larger, much wider area. But this map gives you an idea of what it took to transport people from Hungary, which is at the bottom of this slide, And the next station was Slovak Republic, and then Poland after that, which is where the death camps were located. So how did this work in the capital city, Budapest, which is where our family lived, which is where I ended up? My mother actually ended up in hiding in another location. So the plan to deal with the Jewish population in Budapest was that after the railroad stock was depleted, transportation to death camps was no longer feasible, the Jews were actually located into, I guess it's not there, okay, into a relatively small area. It's about 6 square blocks, and that was surrounded by the fence. As you can see, there was a guard, and only under very special circumstances were the Jews allowed to leave this particular area. Otherwise, they had to go inside and live there for a period of about 6 to 8 weeks, which was under very difficult circumstances. The health care was almost non-existent inside this fence. Food was very short in supply. There was a lot of suffering. There was a lot of disease. And the final plan was to surround this 6 square block area with explosives and eventually blow it up. And that was supposed to be the fate of the Hungarian Jewish population. From the outlying areas, most of them perished in the death camps. Few who were left over, they were beginning to shoot them into the Danube, but then when somebody was left over after that, this particular ghetto in Budapest was supposed to take care of it. Now, moving on to my story, when my mother went into hiding, because she was the only person among my relatives who was under 40 years of age, except for more children, and she was under direct threat to being taken to a death camp. That's the reason she went into hiding, and that happened about toward the end of October in 1944. So I was left on my own. I was taken to an orphanage which closed down a week after I arrived there. Hopefully nothing to do with my presence, but the circumstances and the war and the Nazis were calling the shots. And then I was taken to a big roundup facility where they were getting people ready to transport into this ghetto area. During this period, it turns out I was discovered to have contracted scarlet fever, which is a highly contagious disease. Two teenagers and myself were put into a separate room because the three of us had this disease. And when the Hungarian Nazis came to take everybody into the ghetto, I escaped because nobody wanted to come even close to us, let alone taking us anywhere, because of the contagious disease that we had. So this disease that could be very dangerous, in my case, turned out to be a blessing, because my temperature actually never got even close to 100 degrees, which is quite common among these patients. And I had the red lesions all around my body, but I had no pain, I had no serious consequences. And I was taken to this hospital, which is in the bottom of the slide, which was one of the newer hospitals in Budapest at the time, and actually one of the wings was designated for patients who had the scarlet fever, and I was with soldiers who had the same disease. And actually for the rest of the year, which was essentially toward the end of the war for Hungary, I received very good care, 3 meals a day, and medical supervision. And just like the other soldiers who served in the army, I, again, was very fortunate to receive that kind of treatment compared to the people who had to go to the ghetto. And some of my friends that I talked to after the war told me that some of the experiences were truly horrible. So I was fortunate, and in the meantime, the Red Army, the Russians were pushing west, and they were pushing the German army very hard, and they reached Budapest at the end of 1944. And they actually entered the city, which the Russians decided to take by street fighting rather than bombarding by artillery and air. And it was a very slow process. So by the end of 1944, they reached a hospital where I was housed. And one day we woke up and all the nurses and doctors were gone. Unfortunately, the food was gone as well. So 2 of the boys and myself had a decision to make, along with all the other patients. Where are we going to go? What are we going to do? Because chances of survival in that hospital was not good. So we decided to undertake the journey, which is shown here on the map of Budapest. Here's the Danube, which is close to the district where I was born and used to live. I was here outside the city limits, about a 10-mile walk back to the place where I wanted to go back to actually, hopefully, link up with my family. In the meantime, as you can see, a lot of Budapest was left in ruins. The 7 bridges across the Danube were all destroyed by the Nazis to slow down the progress of the Russian Red Army. Other parts of the city, including the Royal Castle, which has been beautifully restored, and if some of you visit Budapest, I certainly would encourage you to see that, because it is in very good shape now, but it was very badly damaged during that period. So we undertook this journey, and it took about a week because I encountered some problems along the way. About here in the journey, there was a factory that was making tractors that was occupied by Germans. When we got there, the Russians just kicked the Germans out. And in the process, we stayed with Russian soldiers one night. Then we moved on, and this was a very arduous and very slow trip. Even though it's only about 10 miles, it took nearly a week to complete. About here in this journey, I contracted very severe dysentery with diarrhea and all kinds of other problems. Fortunately, a young couple took me in and took care of me for a couple of days. In fact, they offered to adopt me in case I can't find my parents. I thanked them, and I got on my journey to finish up this last mile or so. And actually, after staying in the basement across the street from where we used to live, my mother came and she found me, and she was beside herself because she and her aunt already went to the hospital. Somebody told them that's where I was, but they couldn't find me. But at least my mother and I got back together here. About 6 weeks later, my father came back and began to build our lives all over again, because my parents' store, our apartment, everything was gone. We had essentially no possessions. We just had to start a new life, which fortunately they managed to do. So, how did I end up here? Well, you see my identity papers that were issued in Hungary when I was 18 years old. And the stamp on it is by Canadian Immigration. I arrived in Montreal in 1957. Eventually moved over to Vancouver in about a month after I arrived. And I actually lived in Vancouver, became a Canadian citizen there. When I left Hungary, all I had was this briefcase and whatever you put into it. I gave this briefcase to my granddaughter so she can appreciate the opportunity that Canada and United States offers to people. And now, of course, as you will see, we have a large family. So this was my journey all the way here without too many details in between. And here is the trip from Hungary to Canada. There's a picture of mine on the streets of Vancouver while I was looking for a job in 1957, which was not easy, actually. And here are some pictures of my family. 1921, I believe, we had this family outing at Possum Kingdom Lake, right here in Texas. You see 3 of my grandchildren here. This is my niece, lives in Italy. This is my second cousin and her children and spouses in Sweden. Talking about the consequence of the Holocaust, including the big picture for the whole family, I would like to ask you how many people along the pictures that you see, among the pictures you think are Jewish today? Well, I don't want to actually get a full survey of the crowd, but actually nobody of all these people today would declare that they are Jewish because they were not exposed to a Jewish upbringing. That was all part of the consequences. For 30 years, I didn't live like a Jew, and there's a lot of details that could be covered, but we have no time for that. So I'm just going to move on. But when we talk about consequences of the Holocaust, I'm sure this happened to a lot of other people, a lot of other families. And of course, I'm very proud of our family and their accomplishments. But the one thing that is missing is the religious affiliation, which is to a large extent my fault. Because as I told you, for about 30 years, I also lived without religion. And that certainly had an impact on the rest of my family. So that's about the end of my story, I did leave out a lot of details, and if any of you are interested, I would be very glad to fill in what I can. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Andras. So if you have any questions that you want to ask Andras, please write them on your index cards, and we have staff here. Just hold the index card up in the air, and somebody will be, perfect, there's another one over here. Somebody will be around to pick those up, and in the meantime, we have some questions from audience online, so I'll start with them. The first question is, did you have any long-term complications that resulted from your bout of scarlet fever?
That's an excellent question. Scarlet fever is known for very serious consequences, long-term. Could be in the ear, could be heart. Thank God I ended up with what appears to be no leftover symptoms or consequences of any kind.
Okay. Do you think that experiencing the war at such a young age affected your outlook on life as an adult?
Well, I'm sure it did. But, you know, in Hungary, we started going to the basement to avoid the consequences of air raids primarily conducted by United States Air Force. And I certainly don't blame the U.S. Air Force for doing that. That was their job to do, and they did a good job. And especially starting in 1944, we spent a lot of time in the basement. So, and then when we came out after several hours, we saw the effects of the bombing. So it became very real and very kind of in your face as to what a war is all about. And then, of course, after that, once the Russians penetrated the front into Budapest, we saw bullet holes all over the place in the building. We saw dead horses, you know. I mean, all the consequences that you're not likely to experience during your growing up in this country. So I became much more realistic and perhaps much less frightened of that kind of an environment because I lived through it.
Okay. This one says, tell us a little bit about your career and education. Where did you go for graduate school / medical school?
I'm not a medical doctor. I got a PhD in biochemistry. I obtained that at the University of Washington. Before that, I studied at the University of British Columbia, where I have a bachelor's and a master's degree. Actually, my education, as one hopes, had a huge impact on the rest of my career. I held hardly any other position during my whole life except position offered by academic institutions. So I wouldn't even know how to work in a regular company probably with all the things going on. As a matter of fact, after I got my bachelor's degree at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, I had a job as an assistant lab director for a canning company. And my boss retired while I was there, and they offered me the job to be the director of the laboratory. And even though I had no income prospects of any kind, I turned it down and I went back to school. A lot of my friends thought I was an idiot because, I gave up such an opportunity. But personally, I think it's probably one of the best choices I made.
Can you talk a little bit about the research that you did, just in general terms? He's being very modest. He was world known for the research that he did.
Well, I started my research with a world famous professor who was actually a Holocaust survivor also. Well, he didn't go through the Holocaust, he escaped before. His name was Dr. Hans Neurath. He was from Austria, but he was the head of biochemistry at University of Washington. And the work I did with him didn't last long, but it gave me the background to really pursue what I wanted to pursue. I moved to Philadelphia in 1970. There I undertook work on blood plasma lipoproteins and studying their role in the risk of coronary heart disease. I worked with some physicians over there. Eventually, in Texas, we started a program about 25 years ago which has to do with drug delivery to kill cancerous tumors. And that was the most exciting and the most rewarding. And I'm actually still working, even though I'm no longer an official member of the faculty. I'm only an adjunct member at University of North Texas Health Science Center in Fort Worth.
Thank you. You talked about being Jewish and then walking away from everything Jewish, and then your family left too, and you sounded like you had regrets and that it all came from the war. Can you talk about that? And I'm assuming that you came back to Judaism at some point as well. So talk about what drove you away, what brought you back, and how that affected your life and your family.
Well, driven away from Judaism was far too easy. Even though I grew up, I was born into and grew up in a Jewish family, and my mother lit candles Friday night, and we kept some of the holidays, used to have a matzo ball contest at Passover, and my mother was usually the winner for the extended family. But this is really not Judaism, these are the fringes of Judaism. And during the war, after the Germans came into Hungary, and of course the Holocaust started for us, my mother actually attended with me conversion classes that would have converted us to the Lutheran religion. This was one of the escape mechanisms for many Jews who wanted to hopefully escape the horrors of the Holocaust. Unfortunately, it didn't really help. Well, my mother somehow stopped going to these classes just before we would have been converted, so I never underwent any conversion. Then, of course, came the separation. My mother, of course, had to get false papers that were not Jewish. There was a lot of turmoil in Hungary even after the war. Then the Nazis were followed by the communists, who also weren't particularly fond of people occupying themselves with religious observance. Nevertheless, my grandfather, who died in 1948, made my mother promise that I would go through the bar mitzvah procedure. And I did in Hungary, which was not easy because my parents had a store like they had before the war, a grocery store, and they actually had to have my aunt keep the store open because they didn't want the neighbors to know that they went to the synagogue while I was reading from the Torah during the bar mitzvah presentation. So that was the end of my exposure to Judaism for a long time, because the communist government didn't tolerate anything that had to do with religious observances. Everything had to be done in secret, and that's something we didn't do, except my mother used to go out of town to attend the synagogue when she had yahrzeit for her parents. But that was the end of my exposure to Judaism. So, coming out from Hungary in 1957, I officially was declared a Jew. Then, as it turns out, in Montreal, my relatives hooked me up to a forestry school that turned out to be violently anti-Semitic. It was a Hungarian school that escaped students and faculty together from the town of Sopron from Hungary. But because my uncle was in the lumber business, he thought this would be a good place for me. Because they heard the rumors that the University of British Columbia, where these people were headed, is going to offer a free education to these students. Well, this of course wasn't true, but that wasn't really important. I got a ticket, sleeping car ticket, all the way to Vancouver that was issued by the Canadian Immigration, that one of my aunts and uncles' relative obtained because he was a translator for the immigration service. And that's how they got me hooked up with the school, which I learned very quickly while on the train. We're not terribly fond of Jews. So this was quite a bit of a shock. Some of my relatives told me, come on back to Hungary, forget all this nonsense. Well, I tend to finish what I start, so that was not the avenue I wanted to follow. I actually denied that I was Jewish. And when we had a stay in the town of Powell River, where Catholic priests and ministers came to talk to us, I even attended Reform services, Presbyterian services. So that was the end of my Judaism for a while. Then I separated from the school and went on my own to study at the University of British Columbia. And it turns out a number of us moved together. One of them was my aunt's acquaintance from Budapest, and he was Jewish. So that started tugging me back in the other direction. Even though formally I didn't participate in, I went to the Hillel House once at the University of British Columbia. They were not very friendly for whatever reason. I perceived that, so I didn't continue. But again, I don't want to stretch the story out too far. I ended up marrying a non-Jewish woman in 1962. Had 4 children from that marriage, but the marriage was not very helpful. It was, except for the children, who are great, and most of them live around here actually. It turned out to be a very difficult relationship. And after we got divorced, somehow it got into my head that I wanted to marry a Jewish woman if I'm going to get married again. And that's how I married my current wife, who's in the audience. And With her help and her family's assistance, I found my way back to Judaism to the extent that for 30 years I ended up attending services of Chabad Lubavitch, which is not a fringe organization. I mean, it's a very highly observant group, and I attended services there. So that's
That's a fascinating story. Thank you. More questions from the audience. Did your parents ever speak of their experiences while they were separated from you?
yes. They were not particularly unique. My mother just kept on being underground, working in that menial job, but she survived and we found each other. You know, that was the important thing. My father had a relatively easy time in this army construction camp, and he also just waited out the end of the war and came back.
Okay. When did your family become aware that Jews were being murdered in camps?
That's a very good question, because actually, until there were detailed newspaper reports available, 1946, 1947, that's when we really began to learn about the Holocaust in depth.
Okay. Do you still hold anger towards the Nazis?
Well, against the Nazis, I hold a lot of anger. And of course, that allows me to talk a little bit about what happened on October 6th in Israel and the following period. And for the first time, I was frightened again of possible persecution as Jew hatred increased in this country several 100%. And this is becoming an issue that certainly reminds me of the days that we were frightened, but directly I never see it up close and personal as I see it here on television and online.
A few additional questions. How old were you when you made that 10-mile walk back to rejoin your mother and then your father?
I was 8 years old.
Okay. Were there any opportunities to flee that your parents might have been aware of?
Well, that's an excellent question. There were no opportunities for us to flee before the Second World War. But after the war, one of my mother's aunts, she actually escaped to England before the war, and she came back for a visit in 1946, and she very severely cautioned us that we better get out of there as soon as possible. But nobody listened, including my parents. We had a store doing well, we had all kinds of things, you know. There's not going to be any problems anymore, which of course was not true. And they stayed there until I came out illegally when the first opportunity came, and then they joined me in '62. But that was a long time after the warnings were already there.
Do you remember if you had to wear a yellow star?
Yes, I did.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about that? That's the question.
The Yellow Star regulation became official about May 1944. At that time, we were not allowed on the street unless we had a yellow star on our outer garment. There were also restrictions as to how many hours we can be on the street. There was a curfew after 5 o'clock, and we couldn't get on the street before 9 o'clock in the morning. But when we were on the street, we had to wear the star.
Okay. Do you remember taking it off when you left the hospital?
My mother cut it off once she decided that she had to go underground. And then I didn't talk about this earlier, but we ran into a lady who used to take care of our apartment and do our laundry. And she was the one who got the papers for my mother, but my mother did cut off the yellow star of hers as well as mine before we got on the street.
Two more questions. Were you aware of anyone fighting back in the ghetto area or of any acts of rebellion at that time?
Not at that time. There was some earlier. There was a famous story of Hanna Senes, who was parachuted into Hungary and joined the underground. But frankly, in Hungary, it was nothing that was in the works compared to what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Okay. Final question. We have some children in the audience today. What words of advice would you like to leave them with?
Be happy and enjoy yourself, but try to make plans for the future. And for God's sake, please don't listen to people who preach hate of any kind.
Thank you, Andras. Okay, thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. If you're planning on visiting the rest of the museum, please stop by the front desk to pick up your tickets if you have not yet done so. I'd also like to invite you to tune in tomorrow or to join us tomorrow for our final Spring Break 2024 survivor speaker, Maggie First, who will be talking about her experience on the Kindertransport. Thank you all so much for joining us. And I'm going to ask if Mr. Lacko, Dr. Lacko, will stay up here for a few minutes if any of you want to talk to him briefly when we're done.
That's fine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.